to talk about these issues. And I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll speak. Each of them will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll be able to open up for discussion amongst the panelists and for discussion and debate with the audience as well. So the first person to speak will be Dr. Barry Herman, who is a former senior official in the United Nations and is now affiliated with the Social Justice in Global Development Network, and is one of the authors of a chapter in the book. The second speaker to follow him, and Barry will speak about the global debt situation and the global economy. To follow him, to focus more on the African situation, is Dr. Martin Kessler, who is currently the Executive Director of the Financing for Development Lab and is a former official of the OECD and also one of the authors of one of the chapters in the book. He will be followed by Dr. Magalie Masamba, who will talk about, as one of the editors of the book and as an author of one of the chapters in the book, will talk about the key findings of the book and some of the lessons we can learn at that. And then to make everything more concrete and put in context, Mr. Wakumelo Mataf, who is from the CSO Debt Alliance in Zambia, will talk about the Zambian debt situation and give us a sense of the concrete situation on the ground and the challenges one of the SADC countries is facing in dealing with debt issues. And with that, it's my great pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Barry Herman. Barry, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues. This was an important initiative, and as I remember, the call for papers went out in the summer of 2020, well, summer in the Northern Hemisphere, when the COVID pandemic was raging. And very timely. Unfortunately, we couldn't gather in Pretoria, but we ended up with, I think, a very good book. My approach to this was, oh my God, there's a global crisis, and countries need ways to handle it. And so there was a lot of effort on mobilizing international resources. The International Monetary Fund started distributing loans with very low conditionality. Basically, you just had to ask for the money and you got it. There was some concerns about rechanneling funds that should go into debt servicing to be used in countries for fighting the pandemic, both public health and economic issues. And there were calls to expand the holdings of SDRs, special drawing rights, that is a kind of liquidity that the International Monetary Fund is empowered to create. It was blocked during 2020, basically because the US administration opposed it, and in particular because they didn't want any funds to go to Venezuela or Iran. But with the new administration coming in 2021, that blockage ended, and $650 billion worth of SDRs were allocated. A minority, a small minority actually, of them to developing countries, but at least something was done. So what I focused on in my paper was why and how countries should avoid bankruptcy because of the pandemic. And I'm going to share my screen in a second and show you exactly what I mean about what the problem was and it was only partly handled, and I have a proposal for how the next time it ought to be handled, because there's going to be a next time, and that I think we can be pretty confident of that. But at first, I wanted to note that since Danny mentioned the FFD lab in Paris, which I didn't really know about, there's a briefing that people may be interested in on Wednesday in New York on financing for development as a political process. And it looks like there will be a fourth conference on financing for development. It's up to the General Assembly to decide that. They are considering it now. It's in the detailed negotiation of words in a resolution phase. But anyway, so there'll be a presentation by a diplomat from Bulgaria, which is the chair of the second committee, which deals with economic and financial issues in the General Assembly, somebody from the Secretariat, somebody from the ILO, and two civil society speakers. So as I said, I put the flyer in the chat, so you're welcome to look at that. Okay, now I'll get to my presentation, and I will try to share my screen. There it is. Share. Okay, I hope you can see it. Well,
we can see it, Barry. You can go for it.
Fantastic. Okay, so how do I change it? Oh, good. Well, that's nice. How do I? It doesn't respond. Oh, I know what. I think I know what. Hold on. Let me try again. Yeah. Okay. So to handle a crisis, governments need to spend more and they need to borrow more, especially in the short run. So let's look at what happened in developed countries, the group of countries called emerging markets, or emerging economies. This is an IMF grouping, and another group called low-income economies. In 2019, the overall deficit in government budgets in the developed countries was about 3%. In 2020, it jumped to almost 12%. These are, by the way, figures from my chapter in the book. So if you have the book, you have these pictures. Okay, they borrowed like mad, and were able to run much larger fiscal deficits. The emerging economies began with a higher level of deficit in their government budgets, almost 5%, but they were able to expand to almost 10%. Quite a substantial increase, but nothing like in the developed countries. And finally, in the low-income countries, there's hardly any movement at all. They began with just under 4% of GDP as a general government deficit, and it rose to something over 5%. Now, why is this important? Well, first of all, this shows you right away access to finance. And here's how the money was used. In the advanced economies, the additional expenditure or reduction in tax and other revenues accounted for about 28% of the gross domestic product. That is, the extra spending rose so enormously. About 16% of it or 17% of it or so was direct budget expenditures. And the rest of it were things like loans or guarantees for loans that didn't enter into the budget directly, but were, contingent liabilities on the government, so they matter. Tremendous expansion of expenditure. Emerging economies, you see, a much smaller increase. Altogether, the additional spending was 6 or 7% of GDP, and in the low-income countries, virtually nothing. I mean, 1 or 2 percentage points of GDP. So that tells you right away that what the financial constraint means. And what I wanted to show you here is something about the cost of borrowing. Because in the short term, you use whatever reserves you have, whatever, some countries like Chile maintain, because in Chile, the exports are always very volatile, mainly based on copper and lumber and forestry products and so on. And so they tend to go up and down. And in Chile, they have developed a fiscal reserve fund, so they put money into it. In good times, they draw it from it in bad times. Other countries have large foreign exchange reserves they could draw, but those are costly because the money that goes into foreign exchange reserves is earning virtually nothing in interest, extremely low rates of interest, and these monies are not invested in capital formation and economic growth. So, on the one hand, countries build it up to face emergencies, and on the other hand, there's quite a large opportunity cost. So the thing to do is to go borrow. Now, developing countries have to pay more than developed countries' governments when it comes to borrowing. And what this diagram shows is in 2019, for most of the year and into 2020, until actually February, the extra that developing countries had to pay to borrow. This is in the terms of bond issues that were issued in London or New York or other places, or borrowing from international banks. It was, from 2.5 to 3 percentage points above the rate that the most favored developed country governments were paying. Then comes the crisis, and the rate jumps to 5 percentage points. So if you were, paying 3%, now you're paying, would have to pay a lot more. And governments indeed did borrow, and this has increased their obligations to repay their creditors. So what to do? Well, there was a proposal, but only for countries considered low-income countries. These were least developed countries as per a UN group, or countries that could access the International Development Agency at the World Bank. They had access to a system to postpone debt servicing. And the idea was, of course, instead of paying back USAID or the Brits or the Germans, take the money and use it for the pandemic. And it's not debt forgiveness. You have to make the payment a few years later. But only the bilateral government creditors, that is to say, like, as I said, USAID or others, chose, and the export credit agencies of the developed countries chose to give this benefit. The private lenders did not, and the multilateral institutions did not, except for a small program that the IMF ran. where they did absolute debt forgiveness. So I next have a proposal. Next time, let's do it better. And the proposal is essentially to understand that there's going to be another crisis. It doesn't have to be global. It could be like Ebola, just in a group of neighboring countries. But it's something very serious. It could be a cyclone. It could be a hurricane. It could be a drought. It could be earthquakes. It could, but these are things that need to be addressed. And so this proposal, my proposal, if you like, is to prepare, to agree in advance that come the next crisis, there will be, by virtually all creditors, a postponement in debt servicing. That is to say that the governments will say, okay, you've got, and that the borrowing government would say, I've got more important things to do with my budget resources than pay the creditors. Please be patient. I'm going to use it for the crisis, and we'll pay you later, and we'll pay you according to some standardized arrangements. Now, this is not blue sky. These there are arrangements of this sort in bonds issued by Barbados, and to protect against the hurricanes. I mean, to rechannel spending for hurricanes, so that bondholders or investment funds, or whoever holds Barbadian bonds, if there is a hurricane in Barbados, they know that they will not get paid for some period because the money will be used locally, and instead they'll have this automatic restructuring. And the terms of the restructuring are defined in something called the term sheet, which specifies exactly how this would work. So my proposal is that bonds be issued with catastrophe clauses that say that when some event happens that can trigger debt relief, that it be given, and it be given according to these term sheets. Now, the innovation that I guess I'm making is I'm proposing that multilateral lenders like the World Bank, like the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and so on, also include these terms in their loans, so that they would also automatically not get repaid by countries during a catastrophe. Now, the question is also, in the case of Barbados, the way it works is that there is an insurance pooling mechanism in the Caribbean, and there are precise ways to define when a storm of adequate severity takes place. And when that happens, it triggers the insurance, but it also triggers the debt postponement of debt payments. You cannot imagine, I cannot imagine something so specific for every possible catastrophe. So I made,
sorry, Barry, one more minute.
Yeah,
okay.
Sorry?
One more minute.
Yeah, that's all I need.
Okay.
Thanks. So what I'm saying is that when there is a catastrophe, that it would be for, let's say, for a pandemic, you would have the WHO say that the pandemic has happened, and they have rules for how that would work. And then the IMF staff would make assessments of the need for relief, and then the executive board would approve the assessment and invoke the trigger, and relief would happen. And now, that's only temporary relief. And then my last point is that at a later point, you'd have to have an assessment of whether a country needed permanent relief. But the point was that the bankruptcy, the catastrophe per se should not create the bankruptcy. So thank you. This is all in the chapter. Welcome to read it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Barry. That really gets us off to a great start with lots of food for thought. And I'd encourage people to read the chapter. Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you all. Indeed, so I'm the director of the Finance for Development Lab. It's a think tank that was created and launched in June of last year, this year in 2022. And we are based in Paris. We work with 15 or so. We have a steering committee with 15 or so think tanks and experts in developing countries. And the goal is to work in proposals on development finance in general, and so the chapter that I wrote it in large part when I was at the OECD in Paris, and so but I tried to update it. So the main topic was the debt service suspension initiative, which was very much an ongoing policy. We have a little bit of now time to evaluate it. So that's what I'm going to do in this presentation. I'm sharing my screen now. Can you see it? I just have to put it in. Okay, let me know if you can see the title.
We can see a slide called outline.
Okay. And now?
Still
okay.
On the side, it's not yet in lecture mode, so we can see the first slide says, yeah.
Okay, wait. Sorry about that. I'll try again. Now in lecture mode. If I start from there, I'll reshare.
Now we see one that says DSSI for SADC.
Okay, great. So, and you see the next one.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going on. So, I'm just going to give a few points on this. So basically, I think the question, there's two questions that I'd like to touch upon. Is one, 2 years after DSSI, has it been successful? And two, what can we learn from it? And for that, I'll take you a little bit back in the context of the COVID crisis, and then what are the dynamics that have occurred since? Have the tensions been released thanks to the DSSI? And in the current crisis, which is again a very different kind of crisis, but with high interest rates and shocks on food and energy prices, can we learn anything from it? So let me start by the nature of the shock. So it was a very large shock, and especially for actually if you look at the SADC countries, the kind of more upper middle income or even high income countries in the region, Seychelles, Mauritius were affected because they were very tourist intensive countries that larger losses of GDP, but in a way they're not. They also not part of the countries, as Barry said, not part of the countries that could benefit from this support. Others actually managed to maintain a relatively high growth compared to their neighbors and also compared to the globe, but still for a lot of countries it was sizable declines, and even with the rebound in 2021. But the main problem is that a lot of countries were living from high debt levels, and this is the public debt. So you can see that, Zambia, I'm not going to touch too much on, Melo is going to speak about it, but Zambia obviously had very high debt levels, but others as well, Mozambique, Angola, and that made the response more difficult, and that also, because at the onset of the crisis, that markets were stressed, and it took only until about, between basically March and May 2020, there's a lot of debt stress on the debt market, very difficult to refinance. That created tensions, especially for countries with debt levels, and also very little hope to raise new money on the market. And indeed, for external debt, there was a major pressure. As you can see, external debt was mostly high in a few of those countries, and relatively low. And it's still SADC countries that can access the debt service suspension initiative here only. But the levels were not very high. But nevertheless, because of the low new flows that were coming in, a lot of tension. So that was the explanation, the rationale for the G20 to create in April 2020 a measure to suspend debt service payments, that they were deferred, so they were not canceled, but deferred, and initially it was supposed to cover all official bilateral debt. Private investors were invited to participate. They could voluntarily participate. They didn't in the end, as could have been expected. But so the levels that were treated were actually very small, but it really depends on the way you look at it. In total, the G20 report that were about 12 billion treated. There's about 46 countries over 73 that could have accessed it. So about 2/3 of countries requested it. When you look at the details, the countries that didn't were mostly the one that had a lower shock to the GDP or lower debt on average. There's also a few cases where, for example, in Ghana and Nigeria, that were afraid to scare the markets if they did apply for the debt service suspension initiative. And so how can you compare the 12 billion? So 12 billion, not a lot. There were about 28 billion in total that could have been treated. So that means even for countries that did apply for the DSSI, it was not completely treated. And obviously, one major reason is that the definition of official bilateral debt was disputed a lot, and I'll come back to that at the end on the lessons. There's a Chinese Development Bank in particular, and in some cases, Chinese Exim Bank claimed that its lending was not part of the official bilateral debt because it was on commercial terms, and that ambiguity did exist at the beginning and was never really completely cleared. And so that's in comparison to the total treatable debt in a way. If you compare it to the GDP of participating countries, it's on average 1% of GDP, which is in a big crisis, not insignificant. So on that aspect, I think that was actually an important policy. But if you look at the participation, so it was not very well distributed, and this is more this is an image of the total treatable debt in 2021. So you see that the few countries that had a lot of debt, and especially a lot of debt towards China, had a lot of debt service and in 2021, and so that would have been a major drain, especially in a situation in 2021 where oil prices were low. It was important for Angola. Zambia is another example in SADC. And if SADC pointing to SADC countries, you can read the rest. Zambia was another case with high debt service, but by 2021, that mostly defaulted on that debt. And what was the determinants of this level? So here I show an image of which creditors was the most important for each country. And as you can see, there's a lot of heterogeneity, even in the SADC region, especially with South Africa mostly borrowing its external needs from markets. And on the other hand, a lot of countries only borrowing or mostly borrowing from multilateral creditors. On those two extremes, they didn't get a lot of debt relief. What they did get, especially for those borrowing from multilateral lenders, is new flows. So the IMF made a large number of rapid loans that were not without constitutionality. but also multilateral development banks. But the countries kind of in the middle that have a lot of debt service towards Paris Club or non-Paris Club bilateral creditors did manage to benefit from that, and that's the main images. You can see here you have all the countries that got access to the debt service suspension initiative, and in terms of revenues this time, how much they get in relief for 2020 and 2021. And again, if you compare to debt to revenues of the government, it's quite significant. So often on par with the multilateral support that occurred during this period. You go from about 10% of GDP of revenues, 9% of revenues for Angola, Mozambique, 6 for Mozambique, and 5 for Zambia. Now let's take a backward look and ask ourselves whether that deferment obviously was deferred to the later years, and now we're entering this part of the curve where countries that had that deferred start to reimburse it. So for all the debt service that was due in 2020, starting now, 2020 in this year, and then actually both for the debt in 2021, it's now in 2023. So actually, and the numbers are not very large, but can add to already pressures, especially in a situation like now where the markets have seized again. And so that's what we show here. That comes from work with a colleague, Charles Albinet, at the Harvard Kennedy School, and showing that especially the next year and 2024, for low-income countries, there will be a sizable weight of debt deferred, and so that's something to think about in the future. And then we now see that the risks are shifting and increasing. So here, this is a scenario that we ran where we try to simulate debt service in the future years, taking hypotheses from the IMF on growth, on deficits, and data from the World Bank. And what we show is that debt service increased a lot in the past years, but it's going to continue increasing. And that's especially the case. So the green line is lower middle income countries, which have a lot of debt towards market. And so, I mean, the risk is going to increase significantly in 2034 and 2035. There's going to be a lot of tensions, especially, and I'll continue a little bit in current situation. This is taking into account kind of Ukraine, Russia, conditions of high interest rates, and I'll show you what happens when you take that into account. And there's for the most indebted countries, kind of the first quartile of most of countries with highest debt service, it's actually very concerning. You see the large increase, which doesn't stop, and it goes from 2.5% pre-COVID, and now to almost 4% of GDP, which is very significant for countries that have that can be a quarter of their annual budgets, if you compare that to revenues. And so that's what we show here. There's a lot of lines, but it concerns all developing countries. And you can see that if you take into account higher interest rates and appreciated dollar, for low-income countries, you get almost 16-17% of their government revenues. That's equivalent to health and education spending in a lot of countries, and so that means that materializes, especially this year and the next years. Again, that's another scenario where the dollar is 10% as a 10% appreciation. We have 20%. So basically, if the situation persists, it would probably be even worse. And where commercial debt is more expensive, we had 400 basis points. So and it's about 8% in the past year on average. It's about 6% interest rates in the past years. We do make the hypothesis that it goes to 10%. So it's not crazy hypothesis, given that for a lot of emerging markets, it's way above right now. And so the point is basically we wouldn't need another kind of debt relief for countries that are most affected, but the SSI is not probably the right one. Here I will go fast. I show it for on average for the sub-Saharan economies, and basically the difference, obviously, with the COVID-19 crisis is that most affected economies are those that have a lot of debts on the markets, and so that's the one that you need to focus on. And yet, as we showed at the beginning, the stocks of debt are not that high. So the question, I think, that goes really to Paris' recommendation, and I mean, if you agree that it could be important to include those clauses, because right now you have a big crisis that is mostly on materializing by higher, more difficult refinancing situations for emerging markets, and yet very little way to find new resources to finance them. So looking back, what are the lessons that we can take from the DSSI? First is that, I mean, as a political process, I think in the chapter when I wrote it, I had more hope in the political process of having the G20 involved. I mean, the big question that was at the time and is still the major one is how to get to a debt restructuring framework that includes the main bilateral creditor, which is China. And we're still, I mean, the current system is still very much this question is still very, very important. I mean, and probably the most central one in the debt restructuring to come. The DSSI, I think, was important progress in that regard. It was the first time China was participating in some kind of debt scrutiny in this case. And that gave us the common framework, which I think we're going to discuss next. But the difficulties in the end were not lifted. There were a lot of tensions around transparency, and the problem that we hope to solve through the discussion around the DSSI were not solved. So in a way, the kind of geopolitical hope behind it were a bit disappointed. And now those questions are different. I think the new tools to manage liquidity crisis, especially in countries where, again, the debt stocks are not that high, are important. How can we smooth more the debt service that is going to come due in the next couple of years? And I think I'll stop here. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you, Martin. This is a very sobering picture. I think if you put your remarks with Barry's presentation, the conclusion you come to is we still face a very challenging situation. Not much is improving, but that with creativity, there are options for improving things, putting aside the political realities. So I think that's a good lead into Magalie to talk about some of the lessons we learned from the book. So let me hand over to Magalie.
Thank you so much, Danny. I'm just sharing my screen. Okay, I hope you can all see it. So in my brief presentation, I'll just share the broad lessons that we learned, that we've learned from the book. So I'll provide an introduction to the book. I'll look at one of the underlying assumptions that guided the direction that the book took. I'll provide 5 broad lessons that came out of the different chapters in the book. I'll add an additional lesson and really kind of leave the question open, especially in the discussion about the proposed solutions. But I'll speak a little bit about one of the proposed solutions that actually Danny Bradlow has developed that is not necessarily covered in the book. So I think Barry Herman had correctly pointed out that we started the process in late 2020 with a call for papers, and this culminated in a series of online webinars. And eventually, the book was published in 2022, and it basically comprises 15 chapters. These 15 chapters, or the book, brings together 17 authors from various backgrounds, some from the African continent, including the SADC region, others international. It also brought together people that have been practitioners and researchers dealing not only with debt issues, but general issues around financial management and so forth. But it also brought together newer researchers as well that provided very interesting and fresh perspectives. So generally, the book covers 4 themes. So the first one is looking at the global economic structure. And under this theme, the authors of the chapters mainly looked at the impact of some of the structural changes that were taking place to the global economy. So these would include, so, some of the, chapters that looked at broader issues, for example, Barry Herman's chapter on catastrophes and so forth. The book also had as a main theme the issue of debt management, and if I can add on to that, debt restructuring. It also looked at how do we apply a holistic approach to sovereign debt issues, and specifically in this respect, the chapters that fall under this broad theme, we're looking at transparency, accountability, the link between debt management and restructuring and human rights, and those kind of broader themes. And finally, the chapters in the book also provided some detailed case studies, specifically of Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So in my view, and maybe I'm a bit biased because I'm one of the co-editors, but by taking this approach, I think the book really provided, I won't use the word novel, but I'll say a holistic perspective, because it looked at the global perspective, what was happening globally. It looked at the link between sovereign debt management, restructuring, and other areas such as human rights, for example, and also provided some interesting case studies. So, looking at the underlying assumption, which, many find hard to accept, especially because African countries have faced so many mounting issues when it comes to sovereign debt. However, despite the negative connotation that, the word debt invokes, debt is an important feature, and definitely African countries will need to borrow. They'll need to borrow externally to finance their development, and part of the financing is going to come from the private creditors. And probably, I think, Barry Herman, the event that you mentioned on Wednesday, Finance for Development, is going to be a pretty interesting one, especially when looking at the role of private creditors in financing development. So when looking at this broad perspective, and also when looking at the general, debt landscape, and here, I'll make reference to, Martin Kessler's chapter that provides some very interesting statistics. What I looked at here was mainly the World Bank's 2022 statistics, which actually provides the figures for 2020. The total debt stock, specifically of sub-Saharan African countries, is about $702 billion US. And at the moment, I guess, one of the approaches that is being mostly proposed is debt forgiveness, including especially by, for example, civil society organizations. And of course, we acknowledge that debt forgiveness is an important feature of how we should deal with African countries' debt. But the main question is debt forgiveness alone the solution? Is it, the long-term approach that African countries should be focusing on? And here, probably the answer is definitely not. The total debt stock is 702 billion as of 2020. Of that, if you look at the official creditors, being the bilateral, multilateral creditors, this is only a fraction of the total debt stock. So maybe the elephant in the room really is, how do we deal with the non-official creditors, specifically the private creditors? And I guess this is where, Danny, you mentioned the need for creativity comes in. So going back to the book, there were 5 broad lessons in the concluding chapter, and you'll find this, in a section that I guess is correctly titled, "What have we learned so far?" And this is mostly from the pandemic, but a lot of these lessons even are relevant to other catastrophes before the pandemic, or other debt crises before the pandemic. So the first broad lesson that I guess the chapters in the book highlight is the fact that there's an importance for responsible borrowing processes. And really, this is a call for good governance. And as part of this good governance is the need to have transparency, accountability, participation, including consultations, as well as reasonable decision-making when it comes to borrowing itself. A second broad lesson, I guess, zooms into one of those facets of good governance, which is transparency. And you might ask, transparency of what? This is transparency of borrowing processes, transparency or at least access to data to various stakeholders, be it multilateral institutions, creditors, but also citizens. And of course, the more challenging one, which is transparency of contractual terms, which requires complex question of what exactly should so forth. A third important lesson in the book, which is also linked to transparency and broader good governance, is really legal predictability. And so the conclusion when looking at the contributions by the different authors is that at the end of the day, debt is a contract. And in negotiating these contracts, or at least in formulating or drafting these contracts, you need to be as comprehensive as possible. And I guess the need to be comprehensive is even more important because there isn't a global governance or global rules or an international framework that deals with sovereign debt matters. So really, you'd be going back and looking at the contract. So at the end of the day, there is a need to allocate risks fairly. So there is a need to allocate risks fairly, but there's also a need to balance commitments arising from the contract towards creditors, for example, as well as other obligations that a debtor country may have, for example, towards its citizens, such as human rights obligations. The fourth lesson that the book revealed, and I guess that comes up in the two presentations before me, is that there are many stakeholders in the sovereign debt landscape. So, we've spoken about the multilaterals, bilateral creditors, private creditors, and even among those, there's different categories. And the question is, how do we get everybody to participate in a restructuring when there is a need to restructure? And I guess the important feature here, which I think is alluded to in Martin Kessler's presentation, is really the comparability of treatment between creditors. Martin, you mentioned that the DSSI was important because this was the first time that China was participating, and I think a big question when it comes to the different with the creditor base, especially at the early stages of the pandemic, was how do we deal with China? The other big question is how do we get the private sector to participate? And I guess this is an important question to answer as we look ahead and start exploring new proposals. Now, a final broad lesson is really the need for a comprehensive approach. And all of the chapters more or less point towards the fact that sovereign debt issues are not only financial. They have various and broad implications that could be environmental, social, political, cultural, and so forth. As such, there's a need for a comprehensive approach in dealing with sovereign debt issues. Now, the question is, what should that approach be? Barry, you've mentioned, one approach already, and the question is, how comprehensive are all the proposals that we are coming up with? Do they, for instance, deal or look at financial sustainability of the country at large? Do they incorporate environmental, social, and even human rights, impact assessment and other considerations? Do they actually ensure that there's fair burden sharing? And so these are some of the questions that the book actually points towards when looking ahead. And very linked to my last point is really the need for novelty, creativity, and that the reliance on on the kindness of creditors will only go so far. So there is the need for a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. The question is really whether it's politically viable. It's questionable. There is definitely a need for an approach that deals with intercreditor relations, as well as incorporate some of these broader issues such as environmental and social issues. And I've pointed human rights specifically, although you might say it might fall under, environmental and social issues. I've pointed out partly because the human rights lingo is almost missing in the discussions on a way forward. So while this is really the end of my presentation in discussing the lessons in the book, I think in looking ahead, the challenge of the international framework presents both a limitation, but also an opportunity for exploring other approaches that fall short of a comprehensive approach, but I think will add value to the international sovereign debt framework. I think one approach, which Danny, if you can give me a few minutes, I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but one approach that you've recently
a minute and a half.
One approach that you've developed, Danny, that I think is worth exploring, possibly even during the Q&A, is the Debts of Vulnerable Economies Fund. That is a special purpose vehicle that's going to buy debt of African countries at a discounted rate and restructure it according to some principles that you've developed, Danny, and encourage other creditors to make use of those principles. And possibly I'll just share your recent article on the Dove Fund in the chat. I'll share that as soon as I'm done. So that's one approach, and it would be interesting if we get time to discuss that approach, and even Barry Herman's approach further, to see could it be relevant for the Zambian case study. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Magalie. You laid out the contents of the book very well, and thanks for mentioning the Dove Fund and the article on the Dove Fund principles. But now we need to look at the case, as you mentioned, of Zambia. So Wakamelo, over to you.
Thank you, Danny. Let me try to have my screen on.
Okay, we can see your slides.
You can see my slides.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So thank you so much again. My task is to just run us through key highlights from the Zambian situation insofar as the debt situation is concerned. Of course, drawing parallels where possible with the COVID-19 pandemic and how it impacted Zambia. The outline of my presentation will be, I'll just give a snapshot of an introduction to the debt situation in Zambia. I'll also have a few pointers on COVID-19 and debt in Zambia in terms of how they two interfaced. And then I'll conclude by highlighting some of the steps that we have undertaken as the Civil Society Debt Alliance here in Zambia. So I coordinate the network of civil society organizations that have come together to form what is known as the Civil Society Organizations Debt Alliance here in Zambia. So I start off by a bit of, excuse me, I think I will need my screen to be. Okay, perfect. So in terms of where we're coming from as a country, so we see that as far back as 2004, Zambia's total public external debt was recorded at around $6.6 billion, which then declined to only slightly over $1 billion by end of 2006. Of course, this was at the backdrop of an IMF-supported program, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, otherwise called the HIPIC Initiative then, under which Zambia was forgiven a substantial amount of its external debt. By 2011, we see that Zambia's total public external debt, which was around $2 billion, translated to about 10.2% of GDP. Yet, just a decade later, this figure had increased to around $12.7 billion, which was now around 76.2% of our GDP. And by end of 2021, our public external debt was reported around $12.9 billion. So what we see over time is a sustained upward trend in the stock of public debt more generally, but also external debt in particular. The picture is quite similar when it comes to domestic debt as well. It has been on an upward trend. Domestic debt rose from about 24.7 billion kwacha in 2015 to around 130.2 billion kwacha in 2020. And the share of domestic debt as a percent of GDP has also been rising over this period, rising from about 13% to 37% over the past 5 years. A key issue of concern for us in the civil society has been that while we complain that Zambia's stock of public debt has been rising, we have also seen that there has been a rise in commercial debt over this period. So the contraction of public debt over the past decade really was kind of skewed towards commercial debt, and this has presented a problem when the need to restructure the debt arose. And so over half of Zambia's external debt stock is owed to commercial creditors, and this includes about $3 billion of euro bonds. So as early as 2019, even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit the global economy, Zambia's debt was already assessed as unsustainable by the International Monetary Fund. And so the inception of the COVID-19 pandemic around March of 2020 really just compounded the pre-existing vulnerabilities. Of course, this has recently been made worse by the geopolitical tensions in Eastern Europe. This is the Russia and Ukraine war referred to by those who have presented before me. But at the peak of the pandemic in 2020, Zambia's economy slid into a recession. So the economy contracted by an estimated 3%, largely due to the impacts of the COVID-19 interfacing with the public debt situation. Sorry,
Wakamelo, your slides are not moving forward. I'm not sure if you're planning to move them forward, but it's all still on the introduction slide.
Oh, really? I've been moving. So which one is showing there?
Number 3 of the slides.
Number 3 of the slides. Okay, I'm actually on number 4 at the moment. What's happening? Okay. Let me.
You're also not in SlideShare mode.
Okay, I see. Let me
slideshow mode.
Let me try to go in slideshow mode first, and then try to share again. Are you able to see?
Yep.
And they're moving?
That works, and they're moving. You're going, that slide, that was the one you were showing before. This is slide 4. You just went past slide 4.
This is where you were.
This starts domestic debt has risen from 24 billion kwacha to 130 billion.
Okay. So I think I'd already gone over.
Yeah, you've talked about this one as well.
Yeah, I talked about
this is where you are. The Zambia debt is
where I am. Yes.
Unsustainable. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just making mention that even before the COVID-19 hit the global economy, the public debt situation in Zambia was already assessed as unsustainable by the International Monetary Fund. So what I was about to show before I was told that my slides were not showing was the trend in public external debt servicing costs as a percent of tax revenues. which also exhibits a sustained increasing trend over time. And this has been very important because over the past 5 years or so, I think public external debt servicing particularly has been crowding out social sector spending in our national budgets. From 2019, 2020 through to 2021, we operated budgets in which the bulk of the expenditure to the tune of around 90% was going towards two key expenditure items. The 50% of the budget would go towards servicing the public sector wage bill. About 40% of that would go towards servicing public debt. That's the combination of domestic and external debt put together, which would mean that only 10% or less was then available to be spent on social sectors as well as economic sectors that have potential to drive growth. We also look at just a glance at the numbers in terms of where we stand. This is as of end 2021. Of course, we'll have the latest numbers by end of 2022, but the total public debt stock now is in excess of $30 billion. It's around $31.74 billion as at end 2021. Of course, this would have increased a little bit more going into 2022. But out of this, we see external debt dominating at around $17.27 billion, while domestic debt is around $14.47 billion. Just to mention that the total stock of public debt is in excess of 100% of the country's GDP. But also in terms of the sources of this debt, this has been a very important conversation as well when it comes to the restructuring process. Zambia is one of the countries that applied and benefited from the debt service suspension initiative. And also at the moment, we are in the process of applying for treatment under the G20 common framework. And so it has become important for us to also appreciate the composition of our creditors. In terms of bilateral debt, for example, over 50% of the bilateral debt that Zambia owes comes from China. So, and China then becomes a very important partner in this conversation. And so it becomes important that China is actually one of the co-chairs in the G20 official creditor committee. So in terms of how COVID-19 interfaces with public debt in Zambia, I think here I wanted to begin off by just flagging it off that as the Civil Society Debt Alliance, one of the things we have done is to come up with a policy brief on the linkages between COVID-19 and public debt in Zambia. We are currently finalizing this policy brief and it should be ready for sharing pretty soon. We will hope to be able to share it with Danny as well for circulation. But what we see in Zambia is that the COVID-19 pandemic did not only weaken government's capacity to raise adequate public revenues, it also required its own earmarked expenditure line. Government had to go to Parliament, for example, to go and request for approval of a supplementary budget that was earmarked to combat the COVID-19 situation. And so that sort of heightened public expenditure, whilst at the same time the COVID-19 pandemic slowed down economic activity, which dwindled domestic resource mobilization efforts. So within the COVID-19 era, Zambia became the first sovereign nation, of course, to default. This has become public knowledge. So Zambia defaulted on its debt obligation in late 2020 and early 2021 at the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. But also the pandemic drove the overall balance of payments into a deficit, leading to a decline in international reserves to about $1.2 billion, equivalent to only about 2.4 months of import cover by end of 2020. I also just wanted to speak to some of the recent developments with regards to resolving the debt crisis in Zambia and the next steps that we expect to see going forward. The country has sort of made some strides in terms of finding solutions to the problem, to the debt problem. We have been chasing an IMF package for the longest of time, I think since around 2016, but by December of 2021 last year, we were able to reach a staff level agreement with the International Monetary Fund over an extended credit facility program. And by April of 2022, an official creditor committee was formed, and meetings started under that umbrella to discuss financing assurances that were required before the IMF could consider approving the extended credit facility program. So these financing assurances were able to come through by July of 2022. And so the IMF staff report was submitted to the board, and by the 1st August 2022, the extended credit facility program for Zambia was then approved. And what is now expected is that by end of 2022, a memorandum of understanding should be signed with the official creditor committee, but also bilateral negotiations with creditors, especially those not covered under the G20 common framework, should be able to continue with government, as well as the Eurobond holders, to ensure that comparability of treatment is indeed the core underlining principle of the conversations to restructure Zambia state. So I want to end by highlighting some of the actions that we have taken as civil society organizations in Zambia. So the first step was to come together as civil society organizations and form an alliance, which would then draw expertise from different civil society organizations, as well as prominent experts within the country that have spoken on public debt for the longest of time, to create a consolidated effort to demand, for example, debt transparency, but also to advocate for fair treatment in terms of the restructuring process. So after this alliance was formed, some of the things that we have done so far is we participated in the formulation of a new law that is governing the contraction and utilization of public debt. This is the Public Debt Management Act, which was recently enacted in 2022. So the Alliance was able to get involved in terms of commenting on the bill before it was enacted, as well as making some presentations before the Parliamentary Select Committee in terms of what we made out of some of the proposals that were put in that law. So it is our hope that going forward, for example, one of the proposals in that law is to have parliamentary oversight on the contraction and utilization of public debt, something that has been missing in the past. But we've also created opportunities and platforms to have dialogue with the Zambian Ministry of Finance and National Planning on matters of debt, as well as budget development plan and development plans. Some of the documents that we have worked on, policy documents, is we have produced an analysis of the IMF program for Zambia, the proposed reforms and what they mean, for example, for the most vulnerable. We have also produced an analysis, for example, of the 2023 proposed national budget and how it interfaces with the proposed IMF program. Just also to mention that the underlying policy document for the IMF program had been the 8th National Development Plan, which we have also taken time to review as an alliance, and also formed a position on some of the proposed reforms. Besides that, we have held a couple of meetings with the International Monetary Fund officials, where we shared our concerns on matters of economic development and debt in Zambia. We recently held a symposium with the Ministry of Finance here, where we presented our position on these various policy documents. We are also working to raise awareness on the negative impact of unsustainable debt for Zambia, and we're using various media of communication, such as radio and TV programs, just to take the debt conversation forward. That is the end of my presentation. I'll be happy to interact later on. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Wakumelo. That's very interesting. It's interesting to see how civil society is playing a role in the situation in Zambia. I've been monitoring the chat box, and there's two questions that have come up through the chat box, and I'm going to add a third question, which to answer the one question from Brad Henderson for Barry had to do with, as I understood it, the role of catastrophes in Asia, and whether there was a role for catastrophe bonds, or whether they could have played a role there. I know Barry answered the question in the chat box, but maybe we can have that live as well. There was a second question, and I think this is for anyone really, for Malin Florentin on the risk of insolvency and what the impact of that might be on contractual terms. And then I wanted to add a third question, particularly for Wakumelo on the Zambian situation, on whether the CSO Alliance is playing any particular role in the debt restructuring discussions with the creditors, and whether that's even a possibility. I think we have about 10, 15 minutes left. So maybe what we can do is take people who can respond to those questions and also respond to any comments they want to add to that. And then we can see where we go from there. So Barry, let me start with you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm not sure if there are any examples in Asia of the catastrophe bonds or things of that sort, or catastrophe clauses in bonds. Certainly they would apply in the South Pacific and to the islands, just as the Caribbean initiative, you know, and well, Barbados is a case in point, but in principle, it could apply anywhere. Maybe I should stop there because others, I mean, there are other points, and maybe I want to ask some questions later too.
Can I just push you a little bit? Do you think there's any application you can think of in the SADC region for catastrophe clauses?
Yeah,
because you know there have been hurricanes in Mozambique.
Yeah, sure. Well, okay, so there is. I don't remember the name, but there is an African drought relief insurance fund, which also has, you know, sort of very sort of technical criteria for triggering payment to the countries when there is a drought. So with that, the private creditors ought to be as willing as in Barbados, you know, to have drought-related catastrophe clauses. But I was proposing this as universal, you know, that it should be part of the contracts, and also, as I said, involve the multilateral institutions. You know, I think this business in the World Bank and the president of the World Bank worrying about his AAA rating, I think is way overblown. I mean, and I have never seen any argument that really supports his worry. And then on the other hand, there are now proposals that the multilateral development bank should lend a lot more money, use their capital in different ways. And in fact, maybe there's something wrong if they have a AAA rating because they're not taking any risk. And so, but anyway, I thought of it as something that should be universal. Thank you.
Just as a footnote to that, because I know there are proposals that the G20 is looking at based on a study done, sponsored by the G20 on, are there ways to use the capital of the MDBs in a more creative way,
right,
that including getting the credit rating agencies to rethink some of their methodology of how they rate the AAA of the banks. Barry, I noted your marker that you have questions, maybe seeing you starting the last round. Do you want to ask the questions and then other people can have an opportunity to respond to them?
Okay, well, I'm very interested in what's been going on in Zambia, and that civil society formed a CSO debt alliance. So I would ask, you know, is that, you know, there are a variety of NGOs, and I work with the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors, and we have a project in actually 4 countries working with ILO and UNICEF to help civil society and labor unions understand public financial management issues better so that they can lobby better, and lobby not only to the labor ministry, but to the finance ministry. And also the IMF has, as part of its new social spending policy, said that it wants to be open to consultation with civil society and as well as UN agencies and so on when it's doing its country missions. So I'm quite interested in what you've been doing in Zambia, and maybe there are lessons that we should all take to heart about how this works. I mean, our program includes Senegal and Nepal in Africa, but not Zambia. And it seems like you didn't need it in Zambia. You seem to be on top of things. You know, how broad is it? Is it just specialists who know something about budgets, who have a history of lobbying in the parliament? Or, I mean, how did you pull it together? Does it involve the churches? Does it involve labor unions, etc.?
Great. So Wakamelo, when we get to you, that's definitely, I think many people would be interested in learning more about that. So Martin, over to you to answer that and to respond to the other panelists and any other issue you want to raise.
Maybe me, Wakamelo, do you want me to go, although it was addressed to Wakamelo?
No, we'll get to Wakamelo in due course. So.
No, I mean, I just want to reiterate. I think that the book is really important I mean, everything that Magalie said. I think it's allowed to have a close look at several cases in the region, to have a regional outlook as well, and really as it was happening. And so I think it's an important book, and I hope it gets disseminated as widely as possible. Maybe to react on the case of Zambia. I mean, I think there's a lot of differences in the region, and actually in Sub-Saharan Africa and developing countries in general. Zambia is really particular because it was clearly insolvent, and if you look at debt to GDP ratios, if you look at that was very high, which is not the case on average even in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so you really need to think about two sets of different solutions when there's clearly liquidity crisis, and it's really very that clear, and especially now with rising cost of debt. But we're still in a situation where most countries are not insolvent, and where this kind of managing to extend debt service and to extend maturities, and it could help go through the current crisis. And this distinction is, I mean, really the essence of this technical exercise around debt sustainability, but it's really important to remind that most countries are not facing insolvency situation.
Great, thank you, Martin. Magalie, last words from you, and then we'll go to Wakamelo.
Thank you so much. I think the last word for me is really just to kind of to emphasize the need for creative approaches, but also the fact that the idea of an international framework keeps coming up every few decades. And I don't think the need for international framework is going to go away despite questions on the political reality. So as we look for intermediate options, we still have to find a way to tackle what seems to be the political impossibility to come up with an international framework that can govern specifically debt restructuring. And I guess there's a comment in the chat about the risk of insolvency, as well as contractual terms. I'm not so sure if I understand it correctly, but what I can say about the risk of default, the risk of default can impact the debtor and the creditor in different ways. And the main question is, who should take the haircut? Who should lose, really? And in the presentation, when I spoke about a more equitable risk allocation, I was really looking at who loses when there's a restructuring, and should it be the creditor, should it be debt? It's a complex question, but it really requires looking at contractual terms from the onset when borrowing. And beyond that, I think one of the important issues when looking at contractual terms is really how do we get everybody to the negotiating table? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Magalie. So Wakamelo, a couple of questions for you about the role of CSO in the Zambian case, because I mean, Zambia is a test case in many ways in the current environment, but the role of CSO is obviously one dimension of that. So over to you.
Thank you, Danny. So in terms of the role of the CSO in the debt conversation in Zambia, I think it's first important to appreciate the fact that prior to 2021, it was extremely difficult for CSOs to actually participate in these conversations. Before we held our elections last year, the previous government was a little bit stringent in terms of having these platforms for CSOs to participate in conversations. But post the August 2021 elections, we have seen increased room for conversations between government and stakeholders, which include CSOs. And I think this has made the work of the alliance even easier, because the political will, first of all, has been observed, in commitment to ensuring that there's transparency in the management of public debt. For example, I mentioned a new law that has recently been enacted, something that we advocated for a long time, to ensure that Parliament has oversight on the construction and utilization of public debt. This was done, and we have a new budget that has just been presented for approval by Parliament, and it has come with something that we have not had in the past, something called the annual borrowing plan, something that we also advocated for, which clearly outlines how government plans to borrow in the next fiscal year and what those resources will be utilized for. So I think it begins from the political will that we have seen since we changed government last year. In terms of our role, so where we're coming from, it has really been a reactive rather than proactive engagement process, where government proceeds to do things, and then when policy documents are made available, we sit down, we review, we come up with a position, and we would try to engage here and there. Even when it was difficult, very difficult to engage government, we still have held a very cordial relationship with multilateral organizations such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. We have held a series of meetings with these multilateral organizations to share our position and our thoughts on many issues surrounding Zambia's debt situation. And I think we have had a good relationship there. In terms of the constitution of the alliance, yes, indeed. So for now, it's a loose collection of civil society organizations and prominent individuals within the country that have interest and have done a lot of work on public debt management issues. I should mention that coordination is still a challenge, though, because there was an issue, I think, that you mentioned about capacity. So we are still at a stage where we're trying also to build capacity among different CSOs that are members of the Alliance, to ensure that we are all lobbying from an informed perspective. So coordination is still a little bit of a challenge, but we've made significant headways, especially through the course of this year. So we do have, for example, the Council of Churches in Zambia sits on the Alliance. We also have the academia, for example, the University of Zambia is part of the Alliance, as well as but the dominating participants are from the civil society space, like civil society organizations, as well as prominent individuals. So I think that has been it really in terms of our involvement. Besides this, we have also developed a very good relationship with the legislative arm of government. I think I mentioned in my presentation that we have appeared before parliamentary select committees several times as an alliance to give our position on several bills before they're actually enacted into law. So this is also one way in which we are participating in the debt conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wakamelo. That's very interesting. This has been an extremely interesting and thought-provoking discussion. I mean, to summarize it is difficult. One of the things I'd say, though, that strikes me is, I mean, as Magalie said, the real solution to dealing with debt issues, because we know debt crises are going to be a perpetual reality for many countries for many years to come, is to have some sort of sovereign debt restructuring mechanism that formalizes the process and that makes it more transparent, more predictable, more open to all interests participating together. But that one of the biases of not having that, and it sort of comes through in this discussion as well, is it puts a premium on the contract, on the debt contracts themselves. And that biases the process in favor of the creditors, because it means their rights, which are legitimate legal rights, sort of are seen as trumping everybody else's rights. And certainly from a sovereign government's perspective, they have other legal obligations that are equally important to their rights and obligations to the creditors. But the structure of the negotiations, in a sense, downplays those other rights. And that what we're trying to do through the catastrophe clauses, through the transparency issues, through the CSO alliances, is to counteract that and to try rebalance the discussion so that all interests receive some sense of adequate treatment. And that also we acknowledge the fact that if there is a debt crisis, yes, it's true that the government might have mismanaged debt on its side, but more often than not, it's the fault is on both sides. The creditors have not behaved perfectly either, and sometimes it's just like in the COVID pandemic that events outside anybody's control exacerbated the situation, and there's no reason why the debtor country should have to bear all the burden itself, and that the creditors, just out of the kindness of their own goodwill, should give some benefit to them. It should be much more of a shared enterprise. And in a sense, our book and this discussion is an effort to try stimulate discussion, get people to think about that more. So I want to thank the panelists and the authors of the chapters for contributing to that effort. As you well know, an event like this never happens just with the participation of the panelists. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Ada Assad for her hard work behind the scenes, to thank Mata and Simpiwe Kumalo for the tech support that they've given us, our translators who've helped with this, to Malin Florentin, who I know has been helping from the FDL side. And if I've been remiss and left anyone else out who should be thanked, please take this as a thank you, even though I'm being remiss. But finally, to thank everyone for participating in this meeting. This meeting has been recorded and will be available online shortly. And please feel free to contact us if you would like to continue the discussion. So thank you, everyone. And we'll let everyone, if it's the afternoon, enjoy your evening. If it's late at night, we hope you have a good sleep. And for those of us for whom it's the morning, I hope you have a good day. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
and with that, I'm going to close it. Bye.
Thank you.